All right, so you sent over a ton of really interesting stuff about development in South Africa after apartheid, and we've really dug into it, trying to pull out the most important arguments and the big ideas.
Yes, definitely a lot to unpack there.
So for this deep dive, we're going to explore this idea of inclusive development in South Africa, since the end of apartheid in 1994. We're going to use all that analysis that you sent us as our guide.
Yeah, and the material you provided really gives a strong academic perspective on this whole journey of development in South Africa, over the last few decades.
And what we're really trying to do here is get to the heart of those big questions. What are the fundamental questions about how South Africa has developed, how much progress has been made, and what are the really core challenges that are highlighted in everything you sent over? It's a big topic, so we'll take it step by step. I mean, right off the bat, the source material itself talks about how much debate there's been about development in South Africa ever since the country became independent in 1994. It's clearly not a simple issue.
Definitely right.
So let's just start with the basics. You know, what do we even mean by development in this context? I think the source gives us a starting point, right?
It does. It starts with the idea of socio-economic progress, improvements in how people are doing overall. And a lot of times that's measured by something called the Human Development Index, the HDI, which looks at things like how long people live, how many people can read and write, and the average income per person.
Right, those are like the standard measures we see all the time. But the source also talks about a more, well, maybe a more human way of thinking about development.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It mentions thinkers like Amartya Sen and Claude C., who argue that development has to really involve the people you know. They should have the power to shape how development happens and have real choices about their livelihoods.
Hmm.
It's about empowerment, being able to make decisions about your own life.
That makes a lot of sense. So keeping all of that in mind, what's the main argument that the source makes about how South Africa's developed so far?
Well, the core argument is that socio-economic inclusion hasn't been strong enough in South Africa since apartheid ended. Even though there were big political changes, the material suggests that there's still a long way to go to achieve truly inclusive development, where everybody benefits.
Now, the source also brings in the perspective of Frantz Fanon on development. And, Fanon always adds a really powerful way of looking at things, especially in a post-colonial context like South Africa. What does that viewpoint bring to the table here?
The Fanonian perspective, like the source says, is super relevant because South Africa is still dealing with these complex questions of national identity, even after independence. And obviously the effects of its past are still being felt today.
Yeah, and the source actually says that Fanon believed that in a neo-colonial post-apartheid situation like South Africa, development hasn't even really started. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. And we'll definitely dig into why he thought that as we go along. But first, let's look at some of the theoretical ideas that have shaped policies in South Africa since apartheid. The source lays those out for us.
Right. It's important to understand, the thinking behind these policies. So there's the 1943 Bill of Rights from the Africans Claims document. What was the main focus there?
The 1943 Bill of Rights, according to the source, was all about this fundamental issue of dispossession.
Mm.
The fact that land and wealth had been taken from Black South Africans, it really emphasized the need to give that land back and to redistribute the wealth that had been unjustly acquired.
Okay, so that's a very clear and specific demand. And how does that compare to the 1955 Freedom Charter, which is another key document that the source talks about?
Well, source points out that there might have been a shift in emphasis with the Freedom Charter. Don't get me wrong, it's a hugely important document. But the analysis suggests that it became more focused on these ideals of non-racialism and building a multiracial society. And the critique here is that maybe it didn't keep the same level of focus on that core issue of dispossession as the earlier Bill of Rights.
That's a subtle but, potentially really important change in focus. Now the source seems to have a lot of respect for the 1992 Ready to Govern document. Why is that?
Well, the argument is that Ready to Govern showed a really clear understanding of the problems facing South Africa at that time. A clear analysis of the situation. And the source suggests that if the country had stuck more closely to the ideas in that document, the socioeconomic outcomes might be a lot better today. So it's presented as almost like a path not taken.
Yeah, that's the implication, that the clear thinking in Ready to Govern could have led South Africa to greater success in those early decades after independence. And what other important perspectives does the source highlight besides these three documents?
It mentions a few others that have been influential, like the 1994 Reconstruction and Development Program, the RDP, the 1998 State Property and Social Transformation Paper, and of course the 1996 Constitution itself. Each of these contributed to, the framework for thinking about development in South Africa.
Okay, so that gives us a sense of the theoretical background.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to the actual economic policies and how the economy has performed since 1994. The source seems to be pretty critical in some ways.
Yeah, it raises a number of concerns.
Right.
For example, it criticizes the 2010 New Growth Path, the NGP, for setting what it sees as unrealistic goals and for relying too much on public infrastructure as the answer to everything. The source argues that a more comprehensive industrial policy would have been more effective in promoting broader economic development.
And what about those earlier economic frameworks like GEAR and ISGISA? The source mentions those as well. What were they trying to achieve and what's the source's take on them?
So the 1996 Growth, Employment, and Redistribution Framework, or GEAR, is described as a program to stabilize the macroeconomy, basically getting those core economic fundamentals in order. And then the 2005 Accelerated and Shared Growth Initiative for South Africa, as GISA was meant to make sure that the benefits of economic growth were spread more widely. But the source suggests that both GEAR and ESGISA might have been implemented at the wrong time, maybe too late in the economic cycle to have the impact they were supposed to have.
That idea of timing seems really important. And the source provides some data on GDP growth rates to show how South Africa's economy has performed compared to other countries. What does that data tell us?
Table 1 in the source compares South Africa's GDP growth to Botswana, Brazil, India, and Malaysia from 2000 to 2010. And except for 2009, when the whole world was hit by the economic crisis, South Africa consistently had slower growth than those other countries, which supports the source's argument that, the policies chosen since 1994 might have really held the country back.
So it's a pretty clear picture of underperformance compared to similar countries. And the source directly connects this to the policies that were put in place, right?
Absolutely. The argument is that policies that weren't quite right for the situation and or reforms that were implemented in the wrong order have acted like a brake on South Africa's economic development.
Now, the source also talks about this idea of South Africa as a developmental state. This was a specific goal, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Especially from around 2005 onwards, the policies were explicitly aimed at making South Africa a developmental state. And the source defines that as a state that's actively involved in pursuing its development goals, works with different groups in society, and has the capacity, the resources and organization to achieve those goals.
It sounds like a pretty deliberate and ambitious aim. And the source even points out that South Africa was kind of unique in consciously trying to become a developmental state.
Yeah, that's right. It was seen as something to aspire to, learning from other countries that had managed to achieve both economic growth and more equality.
But then the source goes on to suggest that South Africa hasn't actually reached that point yet and might even be moving further away. What are some of the signs that support that assessment?
Well, one key indicator is the HDI, remember that Human Development Index we talked about before. Table 2 in the source shows that South Africa's HDI basically stopped improving from around the year 2000. And when you compare that to other countries like Brazil, Botswana, Mauritius, and Malaysia, well, Botswana actually overtook South Africa during that time, which suggests that South Africa wasn't making progress in those key areas of human development.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark comparison. And if we look beyond just the overall HDI score, what about the specific things that go into it?
The source mentions that life expectancy actually went down between 1990 and 2005. And there wasn't much improvement in gross national income per capita either. In terms of education, well, there has been investment. But the gap between how many years of schooling people are expected to get, which is about 13 years, and the actual average, which is still only about 8.5 years, is pretty big. So that suggests that there has been real gains in educational achievement.
The source also talks about the public healthcare system, which is obviously a crucial part of human development. What are the main challenges there?
The public healthcare system is described as being stretched too thin and not having enough resources. Even though it served the vast majority of the population, like around 80%, but with a much smaller share of the healthcare budget, only about 40%. And that's led to a system with a lot of inequality, where it's hard for many people to get access. Management is often poor, and the infrastructure is in bad shape. The source also mentions that South Africa has a really high rate of TB infections, which is a major problem.
It doesn't sound good for people's well-being in a lot of crucial areas. Now, what about those persistent problems of income inequality and poverty, which are really central to the idea of inclusive development?
The source says that poverty is still very high in South Africa. At least 40% of people are living below the poverty line. But here's an interesting point. It says that the recent increase in income inequality is mostly happening within the white population group, not just within the Black African population, which is a bit more nuanced than how it's usually talked about.
That is an interesting distinction. So, what are the things that are driving this ongoing poverty and inequality?
The source argues that these are mainly structural problems within the South African economy itself. The fact that it relies so much on machinery and technology rather than labor, it's very capital intensive. The dominance of mining and energy production, what the source calls the mineral energy complex, and the high demand for skilled labor all contribute to keeping poverty levels high. There's basically a mismatch between the kinds of jobs that are available and the skills that a lot of people who are looking for work actually have.
And this obviously ties into the problem of unemployment, which has been a constant issue in South Africa. What are the main trends and concerns that the source highlights?
The unemployment rate, if you use the standard definition, is around 25%, which is extremely high, especially more than 2 decades after the end of apartheid. And what's even more worrying is that the labor force participation rate is going down, which means that people are becoming discouraged and giving up on even looking for work. Unemployment hits young people and women the hardest, and the labor market is becoming more and more informal with a lot of temporary and casual jobs, which just creates more instability for people. The source even mentions arguments for labor market reforms that was specifically focused on creating jobs for Black South Africans.
Wow, it sounds like a really complicated mix of interconnected problems. So, the source also delves into some broader theoretical ideas about South Africa's development. What are some of the key points there?
Well, one important point is the impact of global capitalism.
Hmm.
The source argues that being part of the global economic system has limited South Africa's ability to pursue truly inclusive development. It's led to some of the characteristics of a post-colonial state where outside economic forces have a lot of influence.
The source also looks at the relationship between big business and the government, right?
Yes, it does. And it suggests that the corporate sector in South Africa has been able to exert a lot of influence on the government, pushing for policies that benefit them, often out of fear that investors will pull out their money and hurt the country's credit rating. The argument is that this neoliberal approach has really shaped South Africa's political economy, maybe at the expense of the well-being of society as a whole.
And the source even brings up some concepts that we might not be as familiar with, like the development merchant system and the colonial matrix of power. What do those ideas help us understand?
They help us understand why Africa continues to be marginalized in the global system. The development merchant system refers to this idea that development agendas are often driven and funded from outside, without really considering the specific needs and context of African countries. And the colonial matrix of power is a broader concept that emphasizes how the power structures and ways of thinking from the colonial era still have a huge impact on post-colonial societies, even in subtle ways. So even though countries like South Africa are politically independent, the source is saying that the power dynamics and mindsets from colonialism are still there, holding back real progress.
The source also suggests that post-apartheid leaders were kind of pushed into embracing liberal democracy instead of going for more radical forms of decolonization and real freedom.
Yeah, and there's a critique of this particular type of liberal democracy, too.
Which is.
Well, the critique is that this model of democracy tends to focus on protecting private property and free markets, which could come at the expense of redistributing wealth more fairly and empowering the majority of the population.
All of that sets the stage for understanding the Fanonian perspective on development in South Africa, which the source said it would explore in more depth. So how does Fanon's thinking apply to this situation?
For Fanon, development is all about socioeconomic freedom, but he also adds this really important psychological dimension. He was concerned with true liberation, freedom from the psychological wounds of colonialism.
Mm.
He famously described colonial South Africa as a world cut in two with two totally opposite and separate zones.
And the source argues that even though apartheid is over, these zones still exist in a less obvious way today, right?
Exactly. The idea is that even now there's a zone of being and a zone of non-being in South Africa where a lot of Black South Africans are still excluded socially and economically because of racism and the injustices that come with it.
So from this viewpoint, the political independence that South Africa achieved in 1994 is seen as incomplete.
Well, from the Fanonian perspective, as it's presented in the source, political independence doesn't mean much if fundamental issues like who owns the land haven't been resolved. Fanon believed that land was absolutely essential for real political freedom, along with the psychological liberation of the oppressed.
Which brings us back to that really strong statement from earlier, that idea that from a Fanonian standpoint, development hasn't even really begun in South Africa without true decolonization, which includes dealing with land reparations.
That's the main point. Without tackling these fundamental issues of dispossession and psychological liberation, any talk about development is seen as pretty superficial.
Okay, so the source then broadens the discussion to look at those wider factors that have been holding back South Africa's development. And one of those factors is the nature of the transition from apartheid itself.
Right. The argument is that the transition involved a lot of compromises. And while those compromises might have been necessary to achieve a peaceful transfer of power, they also might have limited how quickly and how fundamentally things could change. Some people describe the transition as a reform bargain, where the new government basically prioritized creating opportunities for big businesses to go global.
So there was this trade-off between ensuring a peaceful transition and making more radical economic changes.
Exactly. And of course, this contrasts with the more radical view that maybe not much has really changed at all, because the economy is still so deeply integrated into global capitalism.
Hmm.
Right? Some argue that those underlying structures of power and inequality haven't been dismantled, and that's led to calls for a new political settlement or social pact to address these really deep-seated issues.
So in the end, what does the source say are the main things that have limited South Africa's development?
The core argument is that besides the limitations from the global economic system, the biggest factors have been policies that weren't appropriate and reforms that weren't made at the right time. And this is all because of the relationship between the state and big business, which tends to favor the private sector over broader development goals. The source concludes that you can see South Africa as a post-colonial, neo-colonial corporatist state, which means that for real change to happen, there needs to be a fundamental shift in how the state and big business relate to each other.
It is interesting, though, that the source acknowledges that sometimes the policy choices might have been the right ones for a particular situation,
Yeah.
like gear, for example, which helped to stabilize the economy at a certain point in time.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
But it also emphasizes that there wasn't really a comprehensive economic policy after Esquisa. And it points out that things like the NGP and the NDP are more like broad strategies than detailed actionable policies.
So it seems like the main takeaway is that those really tough political and economic decisions that are needed for true transformation haven't been made. Maybe because of that agreement among the elites after 1994 to give the private sector a lot of leeway.
I think that's a good summary. The source concludes by talking about this paradox of South Africa since 1994. On the one hand, there have been periods of growth, but there's also been stagnation and even recession. It goes back to the Fanonian perspective, saying that in a lot of ways, post-apartheid South Africa is still essentially a post-colonial, neo-colonial state, where real development is still something we're waiting for, not something that's fully happening. The source really stresses the need for a new vision for South Africa's political economy, one that takes into account the whole history of apartheid and colonialism.
So if we put it all together, the main finding from this deep dive into all this analysis is that even though South Africa achieved political independence, the path to true inclusive development is really complex and there are still some major obstacles.
Definitely. The material makes us think about so many different factors.
Yeah.
Potential mistakes in policy, the huge influence of the global economy, those deeper questions of decolonization and socioeconomic inclusion that Fanon raises. It's a lot to consider.
This has been a really thought-provoking discussion. It makes me wonder, given all of this analysis, what's the most important first step that South Africa needs to take to really move towards inclusive development and finally address all the effects of its past? Is it about fundamentally restructuring the economy, maybe rethinking its place in the global system? Or could it even be about confronting those deep psychological and social wounds from its history? It's a question we're thinking about.
It definitely is food for thought.